Miss Marple is puzzled when a plucked rose is discovered at the scene of a sudden death. To others it is only a flower, but she sees in its petals and missing thorns a silent clue, one that slowly unravels the truth behind the crime. Chapter 1. The bloom before the storm. The village of Elcombe was the sort of place where time moved slowly, and even scandal took its tea at 4. Nestled between two wooded ridges and softened by rose-clad cottages, it was the kind of English countryside that adorned biscuit tins and storybooks. The lawns were always trimmed, the vicar's sermons reliably mild, and the loudest sound on a summer afternoon was the clink of china, or the sudden squawk of a startled pheasant. It was on one such afternoon, warm, windless, with the scent of honeysuckle drifting from hedgerows, that the Elcombe Gardening Society prepared for its annual Rose Gala. This was no ordinary gathering of flower enthusiasts. No, the gala was the social event of the summer, a competition, a showcase, and most importantly, a stage for the subtle rivalries that bloomed alongside the roses. At the heart of it all stood Lady Agnes Hartley, mistress of Willowmere House and 3-time winner of the Golden Bloom Cup. Though her knees had given out long ago and her vision was not what it had been, Lady Hartley's influence had not wilted. She did not garden herself any more, heaven forbid, but oversaw her groundsman Mr. Fenton with the same iron discipline she'd once applied to her late husband and their unruly spaniels. "She's showing the crimson dawn this year," murmured Mrs. Lovage to her companion as they sipped elderflower cordial beside the rose trellises. "The one she had imported from Morocco. Paid a fortune for it, I heard, and worth every shilling if it keeps her in the lead," replied Miss Sandley, peering over her spectacles at the other entries. "Though I must say, I rather prefer the simplicity of a true English blush." Further along the path, a cluster of villagers gathered near the booth set up by the Women's Institute. Miss Marple, quietly observant as always, sat at the edge of the group in a straw hat adorned with a modest sprig of lavender. She was ostensibly focused on threading a new needle for the embroidery demonstration, but her pale blue eyes wandered frequently, catching snatches of conversation and flickers of expression with the accuracy of a hawk. There was unease in the air. Not loud, not voiced. Elcombe was far too polite for that, but perceptible nonetheless. Young Rachel Carmody, the baker's daughter, had entered a dazzling rose hybrid of her own creation, a silvery bloom with a violet core. It had caused a stir during the morning judging. Some said it was the most stunning entry in years. Others, less generous, muttered about precociousness and the impropriety of youth besting nobility. "I heard Lady Hartley nearly fainted when she saw it," whispered one voice. "Had to be helped to her chair by Fenton himself." Miss Marple said nothing, merely adjusted her needlework. The awards ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock beneath the grand oak in Willowmere's southern garden. Chairs had been arranged in tidy rows, the trophies displayed on a lace-covered table. The village band, more enthusiastic than skilled, was tuning up near the old sundial, and at precisely 4:15, Lady Hartley herself made her entrance. She was wheeled in by Mr. Fenton, her upright posture as rigid as the carved arms of the chair she sat in. She wore a pale lilac dress, a string of pearls, and an expression of withering command. Her presence silenced the flutter of conversation, and even the bees seemed to drone more quietly. Rachel Carmody, flushed with nervous pride, stood a few paces behind, her rose safely ensconced in a porcelain vase. She held a folded handkerchief in one hand, and her gaze kept darting toward the judging table where Reverend Forbes was arranging certificates. At 4 o'clock exactly, the first scream tore through the summer air. It came not from the crowd, but from Mrs. Godfrey, a nervous sort who had wandered into the rose tent to fetch a forgotten purse. Her voice was high, panicked, and utterly certain. "There's someone lying there. Oh, heavens, I think they're not moving." By the time Miss Marple reached the tent, guided more by instinct than urgency, A small crowd had gathered around the entrance. Constable Wickham was already pushing through, his face alarmed, but attempting authority. Miss Marple followed him in, and there, nestled among the buckets of long-stemmed blooms and dislodged trellis poles, lay the body of Mr. Horace Denby, local rose expert and judge for the competition. His arms were curled awkwardly beneath him, and his face was turned to one side, eyes open, expression blank. Beside his head lay a single, freshly plucked rose dot. It was Rachel's. The distinctive silver-violet petals were unmistakable. Constable Wickham cleared his throat and muttered something about cordoning off the area. Lady Hartley had not yet been informed, though whispers were already sweeping across the lawn like a tide. Miss Marple, unhurried, moved a little closer and knelt with surprising ease. She did not touch the body, nor the rose, but she observed the slight smudge of soil near Mr. Denby's collar, the faint perfume in the air that did not belong to Rachel's rose, the overturned watering can beside the bench, and finally, her gaze settled on the rose itself. Plucked, but not hastily, not in anger. Deliberately. Miss Marple rose slowly, brushing off her gloves. Behind her, Rachel stood pale as linen, her hand now clutching her handkerchief with trembling fingers. Across the lawn, Lady Hartley sat unmoving, eyes narrowed. The garden, which had been full of color and clatter just moments before, now stood suspended in a dreadful hush. Another rose had been chosen, but this one bloomed with death. And Miss Marple, already piecing the pattern in her mind, knew that the petals had only begun to fall. Chapter 2. Whispers among the roses. The police had arrived by early evening, their boots leaving unsightly dents in the velvet-soft lawn of Willowmere's southern garden. Constable Wickham, already flustered by the weight of responsibility, had cordoned off the rose tent with garden rope borrowed from the vicar's wife, and made a valiant attempt to disperse the murmuring crowd. But dispersing a village's curiosity was never so simple, especially when it concerned murder, and especially when that murder had unfolded in the heart of a competition. Miss Marple remained just on the periphery, seated once more on her folding stool beneath the shade of a cherry tree. She had resumed her needlework, but the thread had not moved in 10 minutes. Her eyes, beneath the gentle droop of her sun hat, were fixed on the shifting constellations of people and gossip round her. She saw Rachel Carmody speaking in low tones to her father, whose flower-dusted apron clashed oddly with the solemnity of the moment. She noted Mr. Fenton standing ramrod straight near Lady Hartley's wheelchair, his jaw tight and his eyes scanning every face, and she saw Lady Hartley herself paler than usual, but composed, being wheeled away by Miss Sandley toward the house for a medicinal sherry. By 6 o'clock, a gray car from the county constabulary pulled up the gravel drive, and from it emerged a thin man in a brown suit with tired eyes and a clipped mustache. Inspector Mallory, a man of measured patience and limited tolerance for village theatrics, had seen his fair share of countryside scandals, but murder at a rose gala was new even to him. He addressed the assembled villagers with polite gravity, requested cooperation, and instructed Constable Wickham to take names and statements from all present. Then he stepped inside the rose tent. Miss Marple did not follow. She had seen all she needed to see for now. Instead, she wandered slowly toward the far end of the garden, where the remaining entries stood quiet and abandoned. The roses had become mute spectators, their beauty unblemished by the grim tableau that had played out among them. But as Miss Marple often said, usually over tea, the prettiest blooms often hid the deepest thorns. She paused beside Rachel's vase. It was empty now. The judges had removed the plucked rose as evidence, but the name card remained: Silver Wraith, Rachel Carmody. Elcombe Bakery, such a poetic name for something born of soil and pruning shears. She turned her attention to the others. Lady Hartley's crimson dawn, still resplendent despite the heat, Mrs. Lovage's cluster of blushing tea roses, and an odd, mottled hybrid from Reverend Forbes, which had wilted under the afternoon sun. People often said that Miss Marple had a peculiar way of looking at things, of seeing people in terms of flowers or birds or china patterns. To her, Lady Hartley had always been an overbred camellia, cold, ornamental, and resistant to frost. Rachel was more of a crocus, unexpected and delicate, but startling in her emergence. And poor Mr. Denby, perhaps a primrose, modest, quietly knowledgeable and inclined to shade. Inspector Mallory appeared a quarter of an hour later, wiping his hands on a handkerchief and looking somewhat more severe than before. He spoke quietly with Wickham, who nodded several times, then gestured for Rachel to be brought forward. The poor girl stood alone now, having sent her father home to tend the bakery. Her eyes were red, but her chin was raised. "I had nothing to do with it," she said before the inspector could ask. "I found out only when everyone else did." Mallory nodded. "Of course, Miss Carmody, but I'll need to ask you some questions. About your rose, in particular." Rachel blinked. "Silver Wraith. Yes, it was found beside the body. We're investigating whether it was placed there deliberately. It must have been. I left it on the table with the others." She paused, her voice trembling. "I didn't even know Mr. Denby very well." Miss Marple, within earshot, but not intruding, tilted her head slightly. That wasn't quite true. She remembered, quite clearly, seeing Rachel and Mr. Denby in animated conversation near the rose beds a week prior. They had been talking about grafting techniques and soil acidity, if memory served. Denby had smiled at Rachel the way teachers do when their pupils exceed them. "Had anyone expressed displeasure at your entry?" Mallory continued. Rachel hesitated. I suppose Lady Hartley wasn't pleased. She didn't say anything, but she gave me a look when she saw my rose, like I'd broken a rule no one told me about." "Did you remove your rose at any point?" the inspector asked. "No. Why would I?" Mallory didn't answer. He made a note and thanked her with a thin smile. Rachel stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself as if fending off a chill. Later, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and cast long shadows across the grass, Miss Marple found herself walking toward the potting shed that flanked the eastern side of the grounds. It was an unremarkable structure, full of the usual tools and smells earth oil. Faint mildew, but something had drawn her there. The door was ajar. She peeked in. Inside stood Mr. Fenton, sleeves rolled, a pipe clamped between his teeth though it remained unlit. He was wiping down a pair of gardening shears with a slow, steady motion. "Mr. Fenton," she said gently, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." He turned, surprised but polite. "Not at all, Miss Marple. Just tidying up. You run a very fine garden." The crimson dawn looked especially vibrant today. "Thank you. I've worked hard on that one." She gave him a warm smile. "Tell me, do you believe in competition among flowers?" He frowned. "Competition? Yes, some people say plants grow best in peace. Others say a little rivalry spurs beauty." Fenton gave a small chuckle. "Flowers don't know they're being judged, Miss Marple. Only people do." She nodded slowly. "Just so." As she turned to leave, her gaze flicked to a bucket in the corner. In it, nestled among wet cloth and stems, was a pair of rose petals, silver, tinged faintly with violet. The silver wraith had been plucked once, but had it been plucked again? As the last of the guests filtered out, and the night air settled heavy with dew, Miss Marple strolled homeward along the lane to her cottage, deep in thought. A man had been murdered among roses. A bloom had been laid beside his body, and yet the motive seemed not rooted in hate, but in something quieter, more human. She looked up at the twilight sky. Stars beginning to blink awake. No, this mystery, like any true English garden, would reveal itself in layers, petal by petal. Chapter 3. The thorn beneath. The next morning, the village of Elcombe was awash in theories. The vicar's wife claimed it was a crime of passion. You marked my words. There was romance somewhere in it. Mrs. Gudgeon, who ran the post office and had never trusted anything beyond white roses, insisted it was all the fault of those experimental breeds. Once you start meddling with nature, it bites back, she declared, tapping her teacup with finality. Miss Marple, having heard both declarations while queuing for her morning bread, returned home with a small loaf and a head full of murmurs. She took her seat at the breakfast table by the window, where the geraniums bloomed in their terracotta pots, and sipped her weak tea thoughtfully. There had been something troubling her, not just the murder, though murder was always troubling, but the arrangement of it. The rose left beside Mr. Denby's body felt theatrical, to precise, as though someone had wished to send a message. But to whom? And why Mr. Denby, of all people? She had known him for years. A quiet man, polite, bookish, and utterly devoted to horticulture. He had no wife, no children, and no visible quarrels with anyone. Yet someone had laid him down like an offering beneath the canopy of roses, and marked him with Rachel Carmody's prized bloom. A framing, certainly, but clumsily done or deliberately so. Later that day, Miss Marple visited the vicarage. The Reverend Lionel Forbes was not only a competent clergyman, but a devoted rose enthusiast. His rose entries rarely won, but were always unusual crossbreeds, unexpected colors, and once, a spiral petal variety he had named Resurrection. Miss Marple found him in his greenhouse, gently misting a row of miniature climbers. He looked up with a welcoming smile. "Miss Marple, come to see my failures?" "Not at all," she said with a chuckle. "I came to ask about the late Mr. Denby." The vicar's face clouded. "A terrible thing. I can hardly believe it." "Indeed. You knew him well, I think. We served on the village council together. He was helpful, methodical, though he had some rather firm opinions about public flower beds." Miss Marple nodded. "Did he have enemies?" The vicar paused. "Not that I know of, though he had his differences. He and Lady Hartley clashed often." "Oh, yes, over the Rose Committee, mostly." Denby was passionate about equal representation, wanted to allow younger villagers more say in the judging and planning. Lady Hartley preferred tradition, and Rachel Carmody, Mr. Denby supported her. He said she had true horticultural instinct. I think Lady Hartley found that offensive, given Rachel's lack of pedigree. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "You'd be surprised how often murder grows not from hatred, but from wounded pride." The vicar blinked. "You don't think Lady Hartley?" No, I think very little at this stage," she said gently. "I'm just pruning away at possibilities." On her way back, she passed the bakery. Rachel stood behind the counter, pale but composed, tying a neat ribbon around a paper parcel for old Mr. Kettle. Miss Marple entered, offering a polite smile. "Good morning, dear. A small currant bun, if you please." Rachel nodded. "Fetch one," and placed it carefully in a brown bag. "Is it true what they're saying, Miss Marple? That someone used my rose too, to frame me?" "I expect the police are considering that possibility." Rachel lowered her voice. "I didn't do it. You believe me, don't you?" "I believe that you are frightened," Miss Marple said kindly, "and that you are telling me what you think is the truth. But the truth is often like a rose garden. What blooms on the surface is rarely the whole root system." Rachel's hands trembled. "He was kind to me, you know, Mr. Denby. He taught me about fertilizing soil and pruning properly. He said I had a good eye for structure. Was anyone jealous of that friendship?" A shadow passed over Rachel's face. "I don't know. People talk. Mr. Fenton gave me funny looks sometimes. I think he thought I didn't deserve to be taken seriously, especially after what happened to my mother." Miss Marple tilted her head. "I didn't know there'd been trouble. She left years ago. People still think it was because of shame. I try not to let it touch me, but in a village like this." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. In a village like this, memories have roots that go down deep. She left with her bun and a head full of tangled stems. By evening, a new rumor had begun. The police had found traces of an unfamiliar bootprint in the soil behind the rose tent. It did not match Denby's nor any of the known committee members. Constable Wickham, despite his usual clumsiness, had preserved the imprint with a flower pot and a sign reading "Do not disturb police work." Inspector Mallory returned just before sundown and paid an unannounced visit to Mr. Fenton. The gardener, as before, was found in the shed, polishing tools with religious care. They spoke for over 20 minutes, during which the door remained closed. Later, Wickham emerged and went straight to the Hartley estate. Miss Marple, passing by on her way from the grocer's, paused at the garden's edge and glanced toward the potting shed. It was empty now, but the faint trace of something clung to the air, something metallic, almost like iron. It wasn't the scent of roses, and it wasn't the first time she'd smelt it either. She returned home, sat at her writing desk, and made 3 short notes in the corner of her notepad. Rachel's rose plucked before the murder, Lady Hartley's disdain of Rachel, gardener with precise hands and no alibi. She tapped her pencil lightly. The trouble with roses, she thought, is that they draw the eye too much. Everyone looks at the bloom. No one thinks to look at the thorn. But Miss Marple always did. Chapter 4. Whispers behind lace curtains. The morning after Miss Marple's quiet musings, the village of Elkham awoke with a chill in the air and an unusual tension clinging to its winding lanes and brick walls. At the grocer's, conversations were conducted in half-whispers. At the bakery, Rachel's hands moved more mechanically than usual, and her eyes darted at every tinkle of the shop bell. By midday, the tension found words in the form of gossip, moving from windowsill to church pew. It was Mrs. Edgecombe, of course, who saw it first. From her lace-curtained front window, she spotted Constable Wickham making his way toward the post office with a sealed envelope and an air of flustered importance. Mrs. Edgecombe, being a dedicated observer of village goings-on, watched as he entered, emerged a moment later, then crossed the road toward Miss Marple's cottage. Miss Marple, who was rearranging the daffodils in her parlor, looked up when the knock came. She opened the door with her usual serene composure. "Constable Wickham," she said gently, "do come in. Is it about the murder?" He blushed slightly and removed his hat. Yes and no, Miss Marple. Inspector Mallory asked me to check on something. Discreet like, "Oh, yes, ma'am. It's about Mr. Fenton, the gardener. Seems someone saw him near the tent the night before the competition. Said he was acting furtive. Might have had mud on his boots." Miss Marple gestured toward the sitting room. "Won't you have a cup of tea while we talk it through?" Wickham, who had never declined a cup of tea in his life, obliged. "Now then," Miss Marple said as she poured, "Fenton is a man of habits, wouldn't you say? He sharpens his tools every Wednesday, takes lunch at noon, avoids the bakery unless it's a Monday." Wickham blinked. "Yes, I suppose he does. Always says the queues are too long by Thursday." "Exactly. A creature of routine. So if someone saw him behaving oddly, well, that suggests he was under duress, or perhaps performing a task he wasn't proud of." Wickham took a sip. "But what kind of task? Something he couldn't explain easily, perhaps. Something that required silence." She stirred her own tea slowly. "You see, I don't believe Mr. Denby was meant to die." Wickham stared. "You think it was an accident? I think it was a plan gone wrong, or a warning that went too far. But more than that, I think the rose was a signal not to the villagers, but to someone else." Wickham looked puzzled, but nodded politely. "I'll tell the inspector what you said." Miss Marple smiled. "No need to rush, dear. Best let the threads gather before pulling too hard." Later that afternoon, she paid a visit to Lady Hartley. The Hartley estate sat proud and lonely atop a small rise. its hedges meticulously clipped, and its gravel paths always freshly raked. Lady Hartley herself answered the door, dressed in mourning gray despite the fact that she hadn't lost her relative in years. "Miss Marple," she said coolly, "have you come to gawk like the rest?" "Not at all. I came to inquire about the committee's private meeting the night before the show. You see, I had heard there was some disagreement." Lady Hartley's mouth twitched. "Only the usual nonsense. Denby and his crusade for modernization. He wanted to add a youth excellence category. Imagine letting school children enter weeds and calling them exhibits. And Rachel Carmody? Was she discussed?" Lady Hartley stiffened. Mr. Denby had a rather absurd fascination with her talent. I suppose he fancied himself a mentor. Poor man was always too romantic for his own good. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And did anyone oppose that relationship?" Lady Hartley's gaze sharpened. "Are you suggesting someone in the committee killed him out of jealousy?" "Jealousy wears many disguises, Lady Hartley. Sometimes it arrives as tradition, sometimes as pride." Lady Hartley turned away toward the parlor window. "If you must know, I warned Denby. I told him his generosity was misplaced. Rachel comes from unfortunate stock. Ah, yes. Her mother, she ran off with a traveling pianist, Miss Marple, left the child behind with nothing but scandal. And now Rachel surrounds herself with sweet buns and forced innocence. But the stain remains." Miss Marple nodded, thanked her hostess, and made her way home. Her mind racing, she was greeted at the gate by young Harry Blake, who held out a letter addressed in a shaky hand. "From my gran, miss. She says you'll know what it means." Miss Marple took the letter and opened it inside, her fingers moving with practiced care. Inside was a single sentence written in blotchy ink. "He asked for the rose back that same night." There was no signature, but Miss Marple knew at once who it was from: old Hester Lobb, who had worked in the Carmody household years ago before Rachel's mother vanished. Hester had grown increasingly reclusive, her voice seldom heard now beyond cryptic letters and nods behind the curtains. She read the sentence again, this time aloud. "He asked for the rose back." It changed everything. She walked to her dresser, retrieved her notebook, and wrote, "If he asked for the rose back, he knew it had been taken. Rachel didn't place it there. Someone else did. And Denby tried to stop them. The rose was not a message, it was leverage. But who had tried to use it? Who had something to gain by Rachel's disgrace? And Denby's silence?" Miss Marple stood very still, then looked out toward the lane, where evening had begun to soften the sky. The hedges quivered slightly in the wind, and the whole village seemed poised in a hush. She knew the killer was still walking among them, and she suspected the next move would not be a mistake. It would be deliberate, and it would be final. Chapter 5. A second silence. Morning light crept slowly into the village of Elcombe, but it brought with it no sense of peace. The scent of hyacinths wafted through open windows, clashing oddly with the tension that clung to the air like invisible brambles. Though the murder had occurred days earlier, something in the villagers' glances too quick, too guarded suggested they felt danger still hovered, unsolved and watching. At the vicarage, Reverend Prowse postponed his usual scripture reading and instead found himself speaking of guilt, of secrecy, and of the way light inevitably found its way into the dark. His sermon stirred whispers, particularly when Mrs. Dench clutched her handbag a little too tightly at the mention of unrepented transgressions. Meanwhile, Miss Marple returned from her morning walk with 2 fresh eggs, and a certainty forming quietly in her mind. She placed the eggs gently in a bowl, sat at the kitchen table, and opened her small black notebook again. With neat, deliberate strokes, she wrote, "Why would Rachel deny the rose? Unless she truly didn't place it. If Denby wanted the rose returned, who did he suspect? And why was no one talking about the shawl?" She tapped her pen thoughtfully against her chin. The shawl. when Miss Carmody was found, fainted beside the tent. She had been clutching her late mother's evening shawl, an ornate thing of pale blue silk, embroidered with faded gold thread. It had seemed, to most, a sentimental flourish in the midst of grief, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that sentiment was often where secrets hid most cleverly. Later that day, she asked Rachel to tea. The girl arrived hesitantly, her movements subdued, a hollow tiredness in her posture. "You're kind to invite me, Miss Marple," she said. I haven't gone anywhere since that day. You mustn't hide away," Miss Marple said gently, pouring a steady stream of dark tea. "But I thought we might talk, woman to woman." Rachel's eyes flickered. "I was thinking about the shawl," Miss Marple continued. "Your mother's, wasn't it? Quite distinctive embroidery." Rachel nodded slowly. "She wore it often, especially when she sang in the garden. The gold threads shimmered under the moonlight. It's all I have of hers." Miss Marple leaned forward. "And where was it before the flower show? Had it been missing?" Rachel froze. Yes, actually. I hadn't seen it for weeks. I thought it lost. Then I found it on the morning of the competition, folded on my windowsill. I assumed someone returned it, but they didn't return it to your door or hand it to you." "No," Rachel said, her brow furrowing. "Just left it." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "That suggests the person knew it had been yours and hoped you would wear it." Rachel's eyes widened. "You think someone planted it on me?" "I think someone wanted you seen in it." There was a long silence between them. Then Rachel said softly, "Mr. Denby. He once told me my voice reminded him of her. He even said once that she wasn't the villain the town made her out to be. He believed she was trapped." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That would make him rare indeed." Rachel looked down. "Lady Hartley loathed her. Always said we were tainted." Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind was already turning, lining up names and memories. That very word tainted had been spoken just 2 days ago, that evening. A strange hush fell over the village. It came first in the form of a bell that did not chime, Malcolm's church bell, wound and timed by habit. But this time, there was no evening ring. Constable Wickham was first to notice it. And when he arrived at the chapel, he found the vestry door ajar and Reverend Prowse standing motionless at the altar, his face pale. The copper bell rope had been cut at its base, cleanly severed, the end frayed like the edge of a plucked rose. A scrap of blue silk was found snagged on the brass candlestick. Miss Marple arrived shortly after, called by a trembling Mrs. Edgecombe, who had overheard the discovery from the passing grocer boy. "Another message," she whispered to the constable as they both stared at the discarded cloth. He looked at her with weary confusion. "What does it mean?" Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on the thread of blue silk. "It means the killer isn't finished. And more importantly, it means they think they've been seen." Constable Wickham frowned. "Seen? By who?" Miss Marple turned, her expression unreadable. "Not by who. By what?" And then she left, the hem of her gray cardigan brushing softly against the stones. Her footsteps absorbed into the deepening dusk inside her home. She lit a lamp and sat by the window. She opened her notebook once again and added a single sentence. "The killer is panicking, but not because of guilt, because of exposure." She closed the notebook and folded her hands, staring out at the path below, which glowed faintly under the first touch of moonlight. Someone in the village was covering old sins with fresh ones, and Miss Marple now knew who had plucked the rose. Chapter 6. Whispers. Behind the hedgeth. Following morning dawned heavy with overcast skies, the kind that made Elcombe's hedgerows seem thicker, the footpaths narrower, and the quiet more absolute. It was not yet 9 when Miss Marple stood at her gate, watching the road with that particular stillness that always preceded a deduction. She hadn't yet moved when the postman trudged by, muttered something about bad omens, and handed her a single letter, no return address. But the writing was unmistakable. fine, meticulous, and faintly scented with lavender. Inside was a small slip of paper. 3 words written in violet ink. He saw everything. No signature. No date. Miss Marple folded it neatly, not alarmed, but sharpened. Someone had slipped past her notice and she did not care for that. She placed the letter beside her teacup and turned to her knitting, though her eyes drifted more often to the window than her stitches. Across the lane, a commotion had begun outside the Rose and Hound. Reverend Prowse, Lady Hartley, and Miss Carmody were gathered in tight formation. Even from afar, she could read the tension in their posture. The villagers of Elcombe didn't argue in public unless something had truly disturbed the soil. Beneath their polite facades, Miss Marple reached for her coat. A deliberate threat, Lady Hartley declared, her voice clipped. Blue silk at the altar? A sacrilege. This isn't mischief, it's cruelty. Reverend Prowse, though clearly shaken, remained mild. We mustn't assume malice in every shadow. Perhaps a prank, a prank? Lady Hartley's jaw tightened. When the bell rope is cut and Rachel's mother's shawl is draped across the lectern, Miss Carmody, still pale from her collapse 2 days earlier, murmured, "I didn't see who left it, but someone meant us to feel it." Miss Marple stepped forward just then, her voice calm. "Did anyone notice if the vestry window was open before the bell was cut?" They all turned. Lady Hartley sniffed. "And what relevance would that have, Miss Marple? Only that the lock is loose. It could have allowed entry unnoticed, especially by someone familiar with its flaw." Reverend Prowse looked surprised. "I'd never considered. You wouldn't. You trust your walls," she said gently. "But we old women know walls hear more than they speak." Lady Hartley, unamused, turned on her heel. "This village is unraveling. If the authorities don't act, I shall send word to my cousin at the Home Office." Reverend Prowse gave Miss Marple a helpless look. "She's not wrong. We need a proper investigation." Miss Marple smiled thinly. "You'll have one. Just not the sort she imagines." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid an unexpected visit to the gardens behind the old Chandler house, where Rachel was said to have retreated for peace. Sure enough, she found the girl bent over the remains of a once-proud hydrangea bush, its blooms dulling in the autumn air. "May I?" Miss Marple asked, motioning to the bench. Rachel nodded. Her hands were dirty from digging. They used to say Mother could coax roses from stone. "I can't even keep these alive." Miss Marple sat beside her. "The flowers don't judge us, dear, but people do. Especially when they fear the truth might brush too near." Rachel looked at her, eyes darkened with sleeplessness. "Someone wants me blamed, don't they?" "I believe someone wants to keep you frightened," Miss Marple said softly. "There's a difference." Rachel exhaled slowly, hugging her knees. "Last night, I thought I saw someone in the garden, just past the hedges, but when I looked again, they were gone. Could it have been Miss Carmody?" Rachel hesitated. "I don't know. She's been acting odd, muttering sometimes. Her nerves were always delicate, but now it's like she's rehearsing something when no one's around." Miss Marple considered that. "Miss Carmody has lived in Elcombe for decades. She was close with your mother, wasn't she?" Rachel nodded. "At first, but then something happened. I don't know what. They stopped speaking when I was still little." Miss Marple pressed her lips together. "Sometimes women carry guilt like a second shawl, folded close, never aired." By evening, the rain had begun soft, persistent, just enough to blur footprints. But Miss Marple noticed a curious sight outside her window. Mr. Abbott, the antiques dealer, standing too long beneath the yew tree near the vicarage, as if waiting for a signal. She waited until he left, then followed slowly, umbrella firm in hand. Behind the yew tree, tucked carefully beneath the roots, was a child's wooden toy, a spinning top painted in faded red and yellow stripes. Miss Marple picked it up, puzzled. Then she saw the scratch marks on its side, initials. See Rachel Carmody. It meant nothing, and yet it meant everything. She returned home, set the toy beside her notebook, and stared at the pieces gathering in her mind. The shawl, the rose, the silence of bells. A toy no longer played with, hidden in soil. Who would bury a child's toy beneath a sacred tree? Only someone afraid it might speak. Miss Marple looked out at the rain-soaked village and whispered softly, "You've tried to forget her, haven't you? But she's coming back now, whether you like it or not." Chapter 7. The silence in the tea room. The next morning in Elcombe was unusually quiet. Not the peaceful hush of routine, but a tense, unnatural stillness, as though the village itself had paused to listen. The rain from the previous evening had soaked into the stone paths, leaving the air thick with the scent of moss and damp ivy. Church bells did not ring, nor did birds chirp as usual near the vicarage. Instead, the stillness was punctuated only by the occasional creak of a shutter or the distant clatter of porcelain from behind closed doors. Miss Marple sat at her usual spot near the window, the spinning top now joined by the anonymous violet-inked note. Her hands were idle. She was no longer knitting. There came a knock, soft, cautious. When she opened the door, she found Mr. Abbott, the antique dealer, hat in hand, raincoat still damp. "May I come in, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. She stepped aside, motioning toward the sitting room. "I expected you might." He paused at the threshold of the room, eyes fixed upon the small wooden toy on her side table. "You found it then?" Miss Marple tilted her head gently. "Yes, you buried it, didn't you?" Beneath the "you," Mr. Abbott gave a faint, mirthless chuckle. "I didn't kill anyone, if that's what you're wondering. I never said you had. But the object belonged to Rachel Carmody, didn't it?" "It did." He sat, folding his hands. "It's from before the fire. When she was a child. A fire." He hesitated, as though measuring what to reveal. "It never made the papers. Her mother, Lily Carmody, was involved with someone. The house caught fire late one evening, kitchen stove left burning. Lily got out, but a child from the village was inside. No one talked about it after. It was easier to call it an accident." Miss Marple's brows lifted. "Whose child?" Abbott stared at the spinning top. "That was never clear. Lily refused to speak of it. Miss Carmody the elder shut down completely after that. Took to church and long walks. And Rachel, well, she was sent away for a time." Miss Marple tapped a finger gently on her armrest. "So Rachel has returned to a village that remembers her in whispers. And someone, it seems, wants to frighten her away again." Abbott glanced toward the door. "You think the shawl was a warning?" "No," Miss Marple said. "I think it was a memory." Meanwhile, at the Rose and Hound, the tea room was unusually crowded. Though no one drank much tea, Lady Hartley was seated near the window, half listening to the conversation around her while stirring an untouched cup. Miss Carmody sat nearby, her hands trembling slightly as she attempted to spread jam on a scone. Across from her, Rachel stared blankly at the fireplace. "I always said the Carmody women were too quiet," Lady Hartley said, not even bothering to lower her voice. "Still waters run deep, but sometimes they run straight through the past." Rachel didn't flinch. "Do you believe I had something to do with it?" "Of course not," said Reverend Prowse, stepping between them. "But the timing of these events is unfortunate." "I didn't ask you, Reverend," Rachel said coldly. "I asked Lady Hartley." Lady Hartley leaned forward, her voice softening into something more dangerous. "I think you came back carrying the past like a lantern, and now everyone sees shadows." The tea room fell silent. Then Miss Carmody's teacup slipped from her grasp and shattered on the floor. "I'm sorry," she whispered. It was just the sound. The same sound as before. When I heard the crash and the crying." Rachel turned toward her sharply. "What crying?" Miss Carmody stood abruptly, almost knocking over the chair. "I need air," She fled toward the back garden, and for a moment no one followed. Then Miss Marple, who had entered unnoticed, set down her umbrella and calmly made her way through the crowd. Her gaze steady on the door Miss Carmody had just passed through. In the garden behind the tea room, Miss Carmody leaned against the stone wall, weeping quietly. Miss Marple joined her without a word, offering a clean handkerchief. "They think I'm mad," Miss Carmody said. Not looking up. "I think you're burdened," Miss Marple replied. "And it's long past time you let someone else carry a little of it." Miss Carmody finally turned, eyes glassy. "I lied for Lily. I lied for her because I owed her. Years ago, when we were girls, I was in trouble no respectable family would forgive. She helped me, took me in, let me live as her companion. No questions, no shame." Miss Marple listened, her expression unreadable. "So when the fire happened," Miss Carmody continued, "when she told me never to speak of what I saw, that the child in the house wasn't hers, I obeyed. But I heard it. I heard a little girl crying, and I know she never came out. Do you know whose child it was?" Miss Carmody shook her head. "But Lily was afraid of someone. Not remorseful, afraid. I think the child was brought there, hidden, and then lost." Miss Marple placed a hand on the woman's shoulder. "And now someone is making sure the truth doesn't remain buried." Later that evening, Miss Marple sat once more in her drawing room, reading over a copy of the village registry. There, hidden between years, was a curious entry: a young girl named Iris Thorne, listed as fostered to the Carmody household for less than a month. The name never appeared again. She made a careful note. The storm that had been building all day finally broke around midnight, rattling the windows. Miss Marple remained still, her eyes fixed on the spinning top, its surface worn and faded, yet still bearing the faint etchings of a forgotten child's hand. Some secrets, she thought, weren't buried, they were planted. And now, they were beginning to bloom. Chapter 8. A name among the dead. Next morning dawned with the kind of pale sunlight that rarely warmed the bones, but gave the hedgerows along Church Lane a faint golden glow. A mist hung low over the village, as though nature itself wished to keep Elcombe wrapped in secrets a little longer. Miss Marple, wrapped in a slate blue shawl of her own, made her way toward the parish archives housed beside the vestry. She had written to the rector earlier that morning, requesting permission to consult the baptism and foster records for the years surrounding the fire. At the Carmody residence, Reverend Prowse, ever obliging and increasingly aware of Miss Marple's subtle efficiency, had left the iron key in a clean envelope on the vestry table. Inside, the air smelled of old vellum and candle wax. Dust motes floated like suspended secrets as Miss Marple gently pulled the ledgers from their shelf. She worked methodically, glancing only occasionally toward the stained glass windows that cast fragmented rainbows across. The parchment, there it was again: Iris Thorne, entered into the parish record as a temporary foster child under the care of Lily Carmody, barely 4 years old, transferred from a private agency in London. A side note, barely legible, to be kept discreet. No mention of departure. Miss Marple drew her own notebook from her handbag and copied the entry in her careful script. As she did, a figure darkened the doorway behind her. "Miss Marple," came a hesitant voice. It was Rachel. Miss Marple turned slowly. "My dear, you look quite pale." Rachel stepped inside, arms crossed. "I was told you came here. Mr. Abbott saw you on the green. I often visit the archives when I'm curious about flowers or families," Miss Marple said mildly. "In this case, perhaps both." Rachel moved closer. "You think my mother had something to do with that fire, don't you?" Miss Marple closed the ledger softly. "I think your mother was a woman weighed down by decisions, some perhaps not her own. But people rarely erase children from records unless they are deeply afraid." Rachel looked away. "She never told me." I was sent to my aunt's for over a year after the fire. When I came back, the house had changed. The air felt different. And my mother, she walked as though she feared turning corners. She kept your old toy," Miss Marple said, gesturing toward the spinning top in her bag. "Mr. Abbott buried it when he helped clear the garden." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "I remember that toy. I cried for it for weeks. It was found beneath the yew like a buried grief." That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the flower shop where Eleanor Tabb, the town's quietest resident, spent her days trimming stems and arranging chrysanthemums. She was known for her gentle silences and the ability to make even the most unyielding roses. "Bend gracefully, Eleanor," Miss Marple said kindly. "Do you recall a little girl named Iris Thorne?" The name caused a distinct tremble in Eleanor's hands. She dropped a petal from a rose. "Why would you ask about her?" "I found her name in the records," Miss Marple replied gently. "She was placed with Lily Carmody for a short time." Eleanor sat down abruptly on the stool behind the counter. "Iris, yes. She was a sweet child. Barely spoke. I used to bring her pressed flowers when I visited the Carmody garden. Lily never let her come to the shop. She was here that night, wasn't she?" Miss Marple asked softly. Eleanor nodded. "I'd delivered a wreath that morning, Mrs. Quayle's memorial. I heard something strange when I walked back past the garden that evening. A child's cry, a door slamming. But when I returned, the house was already lit in orange. And you never told the police?" Eleanor looked away. "Lily begged me. Said the child had already been taken away. That it was a false memory I'd invented from the smoke. But I always knew. The crying was real." By the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the evening sky had turned indigo, and the wind stirred the ivy like restless hands. Sitting at her desk, she arranged her notes methodically. Names, dates, cries heard, toys buried, a flower shop, a child's voice in the flames. A soft knock broke her concentration. It was Rachel again. Visibly shaken. "There's something I have to show you," she said. "It was in one of my mother's old dressing boxes. I found it beneath the false bottom this afternoon." She handed Miss Marple a silk-wrapped bundle. Inside lay a scorched, water-stained envelope too fragile to have been opened many times. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside was a drawing, a child's sketch, a woman with long hair, a flower crown, and beside her, a small girl labeled Iris. There was also a page from what looked like an agency report. The letterhead had faded, but the name Iris Thorne appeared again, along with a date of placement and an expected transfer to another foster location, one that had never occurred. Miss Marple held the papers for a moment in silence. "Your mother never sent her away," she said. Finally, Rachel was weeping. "Then where did she go? If she died in the fire?" Miss Marple placed a hand on Rachel's arm. "Then someone has been trying very hard to ensure no one ever asks." Outside, the wind intensified, carrying with it the faintest scent of roses, and in Miss Marple's drawing room, beneath the soft lamplight, the puzzle at last began to reveal its border. Iris Thorne had not vanished. She had been silenced. But not, Miss Marple thought, by the fire alone. Someone still living had benefited from the erasure of that little girl, and that person, she now suspected, was far closer than anyone had dared imagine. Chapter 9. The woman beneath the ash rain began to fall gently over Elkham that morning, tapping at window panes and running down stone walls like the slow tears of the village itself. Miss Marple, ever punctual, sat in her drawing room with her knitting set aside. Instead, a thick brown folder rested on her lap, documents she had retrieved from the county archives with the quiet help of Reverend Prowse and a librarian who, like many in Elkham, trusted her without question. The folder held adoption forms, redacted letters, and agency records. But one line leapt out to her like a whisper made solid. Custody granted under provisional agreement recipient, Lily Carmody. The signature was faint but legible. What chilled Miss Marple was the second page: never filed, never completed. Transfer to final guardian denied. Child presumed lost in Carmody household fire. No body recovered. And there it was. No body. Later that morning, Inspector Grayson arrived. Though not prone to fanciful theories, he had come to trust Miss Marple's quiet logic and settling in its accuracy. "You called, Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat as he stepped inside. She motioned to the armchair by the fire. "Yes, Inspector. Tea first, then we must speak of little girls and grown women who bury more than their memories." He sipped cautiously as she handed him the folder. "Iris Thorne," she said softly. "Born in London. Transferred to Lily Carmody's care. Never seen again after the fire. But there's no record of her death, Inspector. Only the presumption, which, as you know, is not quite the same thing." Grayson leafed through the documents. "You're saying she may have lived. I am saying someone made very sure we wouldn't ask." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the one person who had remained conspicuously silent. Through the affair, Vivian Bellamy, Elkham's antique dealer, a man of immaculate grooming and florid scarves. He was known for his discretion and peculiar fondness for dead women's wardrobes. He greeted her with a slightly strained smile. "Ah, Miss Marple, come to browse or to inquire?" "Neither," she replied. "I came to ask about the rose-embroidered shawl you sold to Lily Carmody all those years ago." Bellamy stiffened slightly. "I sell many shawls, but this one was distinct. Spanish silk, hand-stitched peonies, sold discreetly, I'm told. A gift, perhaps?" He hesitated. "It was a favor." Lily was troubled. "She asked for something lovely, something theatrical. She said it was for a portrait." "Of a child?" Miss Marple asked softly. He blinked. "I remember now," he said. "She had a photograph with her, a little girl with large eyes and wispy curls. She asked me not to mention it." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You didn't think to ask why she wanted to wrap a child in a funeral shawl?" Bellamy paled. "I assumed it was a keepsake." She seemed broken that day. Miss Marple's expression didn't change. "She may have been. But some people break under guilt, Mr. Bellamy, not grief." That evening, the town gathered for a memorial service at the small chapel to commemorate the anniversary of the Carmody fire. Rachel stood near the front, her hands clutching the child's drawing Miss Marple had returned to her, carefully restored, and now framed in delicate silver. She said little, her expression distant. Miss Marple stood quietly at the back, observing. When the service ended, most filtered out under umbrellas and whispers, but one figure lingered near the altar: Dr. Evelyn Harrow, the town's physician and a close friend of Lily Carmody in her later years. A precise, almost cold woman, she had always been considered reliable and unshakable. Miss Marple approached her gently. "Beautiful words, Doctor," she said. "Thank you," Harrow replied curtly. "You must have known Lily well." Miss Marple continued, glancing at the candles. "I did. She suffered much, and yet never spoke of the child she fostered." There was a pause just long enough to reveal something had struck the nerve. Iris was complicated, Harrow said slowly. "Lily struggled with her. There were behavioral issues. Did she hurt her?" Miss Marple asked softly. "No," Harrow said quickly. "Lily would never. But you protected her, didn't you?" Miss Marple's tone was gentle but piercing. "Even after the fire," Harrow's voice lowered. "I did what I thought was kind. The girl was gone. What good would have come from digging?" Miss Marple met her gaze. "Truth, Doctor. That's all that ever comes from digging." That night, Rachel came to Miss Marple's cottage. "I've remembered something," she said breathlessly. "It's small, but I don't think it ever made sense until now. On the day of the fire, I saw someone else in the garden. A girl in a blue dress, not my cousin, not anyone I knew. She was crouched near the rose bed. Miss Marple's heart beat faster, and then she ran. As the smoke began rising, she ran toward the yews. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Not a ghost, not a memory. She stood, retrieving a photograph she had copied from the agency records. Was this her? Rachel stared. Yes, that's her. That's Iris. Then, my dear, Miss Marple said, eyes glinting in the lamplight. The fire didn't kill her. It frightened her away. Alone later, Miss Marple sat in silence. The threads were almost fully woven now. Iris Thorne had survived. Someone, perhaps Lily, perhaps Dr. Harrow, had tried to protect her, but ended up silencing her. Or perhaps she had silenced herself. But someone else. Someone had known the truth and built a life upon the lie. The final piece, Miss Marple felt, was not hidden in fire or archives. It was walking among them still. Tomorrow, she would place the last stone. And finally, the name behind the plucked rose would be spoken aloud. Chapter 10. The name beneath the Rosyth sun returned the following morning, casting soft golden light over Elcombe as if to cleanse away years of shadows. But Miss Marple knew that truth, once unearthed, needed more than sunshine to settle. It needed to be spoken. She requested a quiet gathering in the vicarage drawing room, a neutral place where truth might feel less like an accusation and more like a revelation. Present were Rachel Carmody, Inspector Grayson, Dr. Evelyn Harrow, Vivian Bellamy, and Reverend Prowse. Tea was poured. No one touched it. Miss Marple remained seated as they all took their places. Thank you for coming, she said gently. I thought it best we hear this together. After all, the past doesn't belong to just one person. It belongs to everyone who lived beside it in silence. She turned to Rachel. You were told your cousin died in the Carmody fire, yes? Rachel nodded slowly. I was 5. They said there was nothing to find. That it was quick. That she didn't suffer. Miss Marple gave a sorrowful smile. I'm afraid that was only partly true. There was no body, because there was no death. A gasp rippled through the room. Iris Thorne survived the fire, but in the panic and fear, she fled. She was already a child burdened by trauma, product of a foster system that shuffled her between unstable homes. Lily Carmody, I believe, meant well, but something went wrong. On the night of the fire, Iris was dressed in the Spanish funeral shawl gifted by Mr. Bellamy. A grim gesture, one perhaps symbolic, perhaps shameful, and when she ran, she left the shawl behind. Grayson frowned. Are you saying the body assumed to be Iris was never found because there was none? Exactly. The fire consumed many things, but not enough to erase a body without trace. The assumption was convenient. But where did Iris go? Rachel whispered. Miss Marple looked directly at Dr. Harrow. I believe you know, don't you, Doctor? Dr. Harrow stiffened but said nothing. You treated Lily, Miss Marple continued. You helped her cover the truth. Perhaps Iris returned weeks later, frightened and wild. Perhaps she never left the village at all. But someone knew and chose silence. Reverend Prowse, normally unflappable, leaned forward. Miss Marple, you are not suggesting Iris is alive today. I am not suggesting, she replied calmly. I am confirming. She opened her handbag and removed a small photograph, faded but intact. This was Iris Thorne at age 5. I sent copies discreetly to a few institutions, and one responded. A school for troubled girls. Iris was found wandering the woods weeks after the fire. She gave no name, no history, but the school accepted her, renamed her, raised her. Rachel's breath hitched. Renamed her. Miss Marple nodded. And last week, I went to visit her. A quiet woman who keeps to herself, no family. But when I showed her the drawing you made, the one with the blue rose, she began to cry. She remembered you. The girl with the red marbles. Tears welled in Rachel's eyes. Iris is alive, Miss Marple said softly. and she is ready to return if you wish her to." There was silence. Then Rachel stood and walked to the window, tears trailing down her cheeks. "All this time, I thought she was a shadow in the garden." Miss Marple smiled. "She was. But shadows, my dear, are proof that light still exists." Later that evening, after the others had left, Inspector Grayson remained. "One question still lingers, Miss Marple," he said. "If Iris survived, then who killed Lily Carmody? Because her death was no accident." Miss Marple nodded. "I've thought long about that, and the answer, I believe, lies not in Iris but in reputation." She held up the antique evening shawl. This was found clutched in Lily's hand. Blood on the corner. A struggle. But what's odd is that this shawl was never displayed. She kept it locked away. Why wear it that night? Grayson waited. She didn't. Someone else retrieved it. Someone who knew its history. Knew it would send Lily into a state of shock. Someone who had a reason to silence her before Iris reappeared. She paused. "Vivian Bellamy." The room seemed to tighten. "She confided in you," Miss Marple said, turning as Bellamy stepped back. "In her grief, her guilt, you were there for her after the fire. And in return, she let you hide your truth." Bellamy's mouth parted. She knew about Iris's return. She told you, and you panicked. You'd built your life on your name, your appearances. But if it came out that you'd helped Lily hide the survival of a child, that you'd assisted in misleading the authorities, you'd lose everything. She threatened to tell, Miss Marple continued, and you struck her, not with a weapon, but with your hands. A fall. The fireplace edge. It happened quickly. Bellamy's silence confirmed it. "I didn't mean to kill her," he finally muttered. "She said Iris would come back, that it was time to confess. She wanted peace. And now," Miss Marple said softly, "you must give her what she asked for." Epilogue. Roses in the rained morning after the truth had uncoiled itself like ivy from old brickwork. The village of Elcombe seemed still not in grief, nor in fear, but in the hush that follows revelation. A pale rain fell over the hedgerows and slate rooftops, soft and cleansing. Miss Marple, seated by the vicarage window with her embroidery in her lap, watched the world move slowly again. The scandal of Vivian Bellamy's arrest had already become fodder for whispered conversation at the grocer's and cautious murmurs in the post office. But Miss Marple knew this too would pass. Villages, like people, preferred order. Even after chaos, they yearned for routine. And yet, beneath the rhythm of milk deliveries and ticking mantel clocks, something in Elcombe had shifted. Miss Marple reflected on it quietly. For all the talk of the fire years ago, no one had thought to question why no child's body had ever been recovered. There had been grief, certainly. The Carmody fire had become part of village lore, a tragic chapter, safely closed, never reopened. But now, the lock had rusted and the hinges creaked with memory. Iris Thorne, thought to be long dead, had not only lived but survived in silence. Her absence had hollowed out more than one heart, and her return, hesitant and uncertain, had begun to fill that space again, but not without difficulty. Rachel Carmody, once orphaned and then quietly placed into the care of a distant aunt, had spent the past week reacquainting herself with the girl she once thought imaginary. Iris was older now, her voice softened by institutional timidity, her hands careful when touching anything beautiful. But she remembered the marble Rachel gave her, the one red like a robin's breast. She had kept it, tucked into a worn sock in the drawer of her tiny room at St. Cora's School for Girls. When Miss Marple had shown Rachel that marble, along with the pencil sketch Iris had drawn of a garden without fences, the young woman had covered her mouth and cried not loud sobs, but quiet, breathless grief. The kind that came when something long dead returned with flesh and voice. They met in the rose garden behind Lily Carmody's house, now empty and due to be sold. The earth was wet from rain, the roses bowed with droplets, their petals soft and overripe. Iris stood beneath the same arbor they had once played under, her coat too large for her frame, her eyes watching the hedges rather than Rachel's face. And yet, Rachel walked toward her with no hesitation. Miss Marple did not eavesdrop. She didn't need to. She remained by the gate, umbrella in hand, her expression unreadable save for the faint curve at the corners of her mouth. She saw Rachel hold out her palm. The red marble nestled in its center like a drop of preserved childhood. Iris reached for it. Their hands met. That was all. Miss Marple turned and walked back toward the lane. Sometimes words only made silence heavier. Later that week, she sat with Reverend Prowse over tea. "They've decided not to stay in Elcombe," he said, stirring sugar into his cup. "Rachel says she's going to London. She's found a position at the university library. Iris will join her once her transition is settled." Miss Marple nodded. "The village is not always kind to stories it cannot explain. London will allow them space, and space is often kinder than sympathy." The Reverend looked thoughtful. "Do you believe in such redemptions, Miss Marple? People being reborn, I mean, after being buried by others' mistakes?" She smiled gently, setting her teacup down with a soft click. "I believe people carry their truths with them, Reverend. Whether buried or exposed, those truths shape them. Redemption isn't about undoing the past. It's about choosing not to pass its weight onto someone else." He paused, digesting that. "And what of Vivian Bellamy?" Miss Marple's smile faded just slightly. "Ah, Mr. Bellamy will be remembered more for his denial than his crime, I think. His greatest sin wasn't the blow that killed Lily, but the years of silence that followed. A man who lives in denial of truth always finds himself cornered by it in the end." The trial, she knew, would be discreet. Bellamy's solicitor was already whispering of diminished responsibility and mental strain. Perhaps the court would show leniency, but Miss Marple suspected no verdict would ever equal the quiet erosion of his legacy, nor the weight of his own conscience now finally awakened. She rose to leave, thanking the Reverend for the tea, and walked slowly through the churchyard. The rain had stopped, but the stones were slick, the air smelling of damp stone and moss. She paused before a small, weathered marker lily Carmody's. "I hope," she said softly, "you've found peace now, my dear. Your secrets did no one favors, but your silence was not without sorrow. Still, it is the living who must learn." Back in her cottage, Miss Marple lit a fire and sat in her favorite armchair, knitting on her lap, her mind half wandering. She had already written a letter to the trustees at St. Cora's, suggesting a more robust reintegration program for girls like Iris. She would include a small donation. She didn't consider herself heroic. She had simply noticed what others overlooked, a girl's habit of watching from shadows. The missing marble, the smell of old ash clinging to a forgotten shawl, the fear in Vivian's voice when Rachel mentioned the past. Miss Marple knew human nature as others knew maps or gardening. It was rarely malicious, but always layered. And where there were layers, there were contradictions. And where there were contradictions, there was always a story waiting to be untangled. Outside, roses trembled in the fading light. The bush closest to her window had begun to bloom again late for the season, but stubborn. One blossom in particular had opened wide, its petals nearly touching the glass. As if reaching inward, Miss Marple placed her knitting aside and approached it. For a moment, she thought of Lily, of Iris, of Rachel, of all the women whose stories had been interrupted and inherited by others. And she whispered gently, "No rose blooms without pain." Then she closed the curtains softly, returned to her chair, and let the quiet of Elcombe fill the room once more.